The radio crackled with static over Kandahar airfield, but it was the silence afterward that made Colonel Marcus Reeves's blood run cold. 3 minutes. That's how long it had been since Hawkeye 7 had checked in. The A-10 Thunderbolt II should have been wheels up from her close air support mission by now, providing cover for the Marines pinned down in the Helmand Valley. Instead, there was nothing but the desert wind whistling through the comm tower. Hawkeye 7, Kandahar Tower, please respond. The air traffic controller's voice carried that edge every pilot recognized, controlled panic wrapped in professional protocol. Reeves stepped closer to the radio bank, his weathered hands gripping the metal console. 26 years in the Air Force, and he'd never gotten used to the waiting, the not knowing. In the distance, heat waves shimmered off the tarmac like ghosts. The afternoon sun had turned the base into a furnace, but something else made Reeves's shirt stick to his back. Hawkeye 7 wasn't just any pilot. She was Captain Nix Raven Castellanos, and half the base thought she had no business flying combat missions at all. The other half whispered she was the best close air support pilot they'd ever seen. But whispers didn't carry much weight when you were 31 years old, 5'4", and the daughter of a Mexican immigrant who'd cleaned offices to put her through flight school. The comm tower erupted in chatter as Reeves watched a black speck appear on the horizon. Too early to be sure, but something was coming home. The shape grew larger, and his trained eye caught the distinctive silhouette, twin engines, straight wings, that unmistakable profile that had earned the A-10 its nickname, the Warthog. But something was wrong. The aircraft was moving too slow, too low, and even from this distance he could see the irregular flight pattern of a wounded bird. "Tower, this is Hawkeye 7. Castellanos' voice cut through the static, steady despite the circumstances. "Declaring emergency. I've taken significant battle damage. Hydraulics are failing, and I've got a fire warning in the right engine." The control room fell silent except for the hum of equipment. Every person in that tower knew what those words meant. An A-10 could survive incredible punishment. The aircraft was built around its massive 30mm cannon and designed to take hits and keep flying. But when a Warthog pilot declared an emergency, when someone like Raven Castellanos' voice carried that particular calm, it meant she was flying something that should already be scattered across the Afghan countryside. "Copy Hawkeye 7, the controller responded, his voice betraying nothing of the drama unfolding. "You're cleared for emergency approach, runway 27. Emergency vehicles are rolling." The black speck continued its painful journey home, trailing something dark against the crystalline desert sky. The A-10 materialized from the heat shimmer like a wounded dragon, and immediately everyone in the tower understood why Raven's voice had carried that particular quality of controlled desperation. The aircraft's right engine was streaming black smoke, the tail section was peppered with holes, and what looked like half the vertical stabilizer was simply gone. Hydraulic fluid leaked in dark trails from the aircraft's belly, and the landing gear remained stubbornly retracted despite multiple attempts to deploy. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered behind Reeves. The colonel didn't reprimand the breach of protocol. He was thinking the same thing. "Hawkeye 7, what's your fuel state?" The controller's fingers flew across his console, coordinating emergency response vehicles that were already screaming across the tarmac. "Tower, I'm running on fumes. Maybe 10 minutes of flight time left, and that's being optimistic." Castellanos' voice remained steady, but anyone who knew aircraft could hear the underlying tension. 10 minutes to land an aircraft with no hydraulics, no landing gear, and an engine that was more fire than thrust. Reeves grabbed the radio handset. "Raven, this is Colonel Reeves. What happened out there?" A pause. When Castellanos responded, her voice carried a weariness that went beyond the physical exhaustion of flying a crippled aircraft. "Sir, we walked into a hornet's nest. The Marines were taking fire from 3 different positions, heavy weapons, possibly a Zu-23. I made 4 gun runs to suppress the positions. On the 4th pass," another pause. "They got lucky, sir, real lucky." The A-10 was closer now, close enough to see the extent of the damage. The aircraft looked like it had flown through a meteor shower. Bullet holes and shrapnel damage covered every surface, and the right engine was clearly beyond saving. But somehow, impossibly, it was still flying. The left engine screamed under the strain of carrying the entire aircraft's weight, and the control surfaces moved in the jerky, uncoordinated way that meant Castellanos was flying by pure muscle and will. "Tower, I need to know, are the Marines safe?" Her question cut through the technical chatter of emergency procedures. The controller looked at Reeves, who nodded grimly. They'd received word 20 minutes ago. Hawkeye 7, the Marines extracted successfully. No casualties. Your gun runs gave them the cover they needed. The silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Castellanos finally responded, her voice was thick with something that might have been relief. "Copy that, Tower. Good to hear." The burning aircraft continued its approach, defying every law of physics and aerodynamics. Castellanos was bringing home 10 tons of titanium, steel, and determination through sheer force of will. The foam trucks had positioned themselves along runway 27, their crews ready for whatever was about to unfold. In the tower, every radio fell silent as controllers from across the base monitored the frequency. Emergency approaches were never routine, but this was different. Everyone knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Tower, I'm going to try for a belly landing. Gear won't extend, and I don't have enough hydraulic pressure to get them down manually." Castellanos' voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather rather than a procedure that killed more pilots than it saved. The A-10 was on final approach now, impossibly slow, hanging in the air through what could only be described as controlled falling. The left engine was running at maximum power, but even that wasn't enough to maintain proper airspeed. Castellanos was trading altitude for speed, riding the edge of a stall with the precision of a surgeon and the courage of someone who had already accepted the possible consequences. Reeves found himself holding his breath. In all his years of military service, he'd never seen anything like this. The aircraft should have been a smoking crater in the desert, but here it was, less than a quarter-mile from touchdown, held together by engineering excellence and one pilot's refusal to give up. "Hawkeye 7, you're looking good," the controller lied smoothly. The aircraft looked like it was moments away from catastrophic failure, but there was nothing to be gained by honesty at this point. "Copy, Tower. I'm committed now." The A-10 dropped below the tree line, disappearing momentarily from view before reappearing over the runway threshold. Castellanos had managed to line up perfectly with the center line, despite having virtually no control authority left. The touchdown was surprisingly gentle. The A-10's titanium bathtub, the armored cockpit that protected the pilot, scraped against the concrete with a shower of sparks that lit up the afternoon like a fireworks display. The aircraft slid down the runway at over 100 miles per hour, the screech of metal on concrete drowning out even the roar of emergency vehicles. Gradually, impossibly, the A-10 began to slow. The foam trucks moved in immediately, dousing the aircraft with fire-retardant chemicals while the runway filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning hydraulic fluid. For a moment, everything was chaos: sirens, shouting voices, the crackle of flames being extinguished. Then the canopy opened, and Captain Nix Castellanos climbed out of the cockpit under her own power. The base hospital smelled like disinfectant and strong coffee, two odors that had become permanently associated with military medicine. Castellanos sat on the edge of an examination table, wincing slightly as the flight surgeon probed a cut on her forehead. The adrenaline had finally worn off, leaving behind the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came after cheating death. "You're lucky," Doc Martinez said, cleaning the wound with practiced efficiency. "Concussion, some cuts from flying debris, bruised ribs, nothing that won't heal." He paused, studying her with the look of someone who'd seen too many pilots come through his doors. "That was some flying out there, Captain." Castellanos shrugged, immediately regretting the motion as her ribs protested. "Just doing my job, Doc." Through the window, she could see the remains of her A-10 being towed off the runway. The aircraft would never fly again. The damage was too extensive, but it had done its job. It had brought her home, and more importantly, it had kept those Marines alive. That's what mattered. Colonel Reeves appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Captain, when you're done here, I need to debrief you." "Yes, sir." She'd been expecting this. Emergency landings meant paperwork, investigations, questions about whether proper procedures had been followed. The bureaucracy of survival. But as Reeves turned to leave, he paused. "For what it's worth, Raven, that was the finest piece of flying I've seen in 26 years of service." The words hung in the air long after he'd gone. Castellanos stared out at the Afghan landscape, where the sun was beginning to set behind distant mountains. Somewhere out there, a squad of Marines was probably settling in for the night, alive because she'd refused to let them down. The thought helped ease the pain in her ribs. Doc Martinez finished with the bandage and stepped back. "You know, when I first heard about your emergency approach, I figured we'd be scraping pieces of A-10 off the runway for a week." "The Warthog's tough," Castellanos replied. "Tougher than most people give it credit for." Martinez smiled. "I wasn't talking about the aircraft, Captain." Outside, the Afghan night was settling over Kandahar airfield, and tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges. But tonight, everyone was going home. The debriefing room felt like every other military conference room Castellanos had ever seen: fluorescent lights, government issue furniture, and the lingering smell of burned coffee. Colonel Reeves sat across from her. A stack of incident reports and preliminary damage assessments spread between them. The flight recorder data painted a picture that defied belief. Over 400 rounds of anti-aircraft fire, multiple hits to critical systems, and a flight home that should have been mathematically impossible. "Talk me through the engagement," Reeves said, his pen poised over a fresh report form. Castellanos closed her eyes, calling up the memory of those terrifying minutes over the Helmand Valley. The Marines were taking heavy fire from a compound approximately 2 clicks north of their position. Initial intelligence suggested light resistance, but when I arrived on station, it was clear they were dealing with something much more substantial. She opened her eyes, meeting Reeves's steady gaze. "Sir, they had coordinated fields of fire, overlapping coverage, and at least one heavy anti-aircraft gun. This wasn't some ragtag insurgent group. This was planned, prepared, professional." Reeves made a note. "You made 4 attack runs. Why not break off after the first one when you realized the threat level?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, but Castellanos had been expecting it. It was the question that separated the pilots who followed the book from those who understood that sometimes the book wasn't enough. "Because Marines were dying, sir." Her voice carried no defensiveness, just simple fact. I could hear it in their radio chatter. They were down to their last magazine, taking casualties and calling for immediate extraction. If I'd broken off, they wouldn't have made it to the LZ. She leaned forward, ignoring the protest from her injured ribs. "Sir, I've flown over 300 combat hours in this theater. I know what desperate sounds like, and those Marines were past desperate. They were preparing to die." Reeves set down his pen. "The 4th pass, that's when you took the heavy damage." "Yes, sir. By then I'd suppressed 2 of the 3 firing positions, but there was still that Zu-23 giving them hell. I came in low and fast, probably too low, but it was the only angle that would let me engage without risking the Marines' position." The memory came back in vivid detail. The desert floor rushing past at 200 feet, the distinctive chatter of her GAU-8 cannon, and then the sickening impact as enemy fire found its mark. The aircraft had shuddered like a wounded animal, warning lights illuminating her cockpit like a deadly Christmas tree. The investigation would take weeks, But the preliminary findings were already clear. Captain Nix, Raven Castellanos had saved the lives of 12 Marines through a combination of tactical excellence and personal courage that exceeded any reasonable expectation of duty. The damaged A-10, tail number 780684, would be retired with full honors, its combat record sealed in the archives of aircraft that had performed beyond their design specifications. But none of that mattered to the woman sitting in the hospital bed, watching the Afghan sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. What mattered was a radio call that had come through 20 minutes ago. Hawkeye 7, this is Viper 6. Just wanted you to know, all my Marines made it home because of you. We won't forget. The base was already stirring to life. Maintenance crews were preparing aircraft for the day's missions. Pilots were grabbing quick breakfasts before briefings, and the endless cycle of military operations continued. But something had changed in the way people looked at her, spoke to her. The whispers that had once carried doubt now carried respect. Colonel Reeves appeared in her doorway, coffee in hand. "How are you feeling, Captain?" "Like I got hit by a freight train, sir, but ready to fly." He smiled at that. "Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. You're being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross, and there's been some discussion about your next assignment." Castellanos raised an eyebrow. The DFC was serious recognition, the kind of award that changed careers. "They want you at Nellie's," Reeves continued. "Instructor pilot for the A-10 weapons school, teaching the next generation of Warthog drivers how to survive and win in close air support." The offer was everything she could have hoped for, a chance to shape the future of her beloved aircraft and pass on the lessons learned in the crucible of combat. But as she looked out at the Afghan landscape, she felt a familiar tug. There were still Marines out there who needed air support, still missions to fly. "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I'd like to finish my deployment here first." Reeves nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "I figured you'd say that. The position will be waiting when you're ready." As he turned to leave, Castellanos called after him. "Colonel, that A-10, what's going to happen to it?" "Parts and scrap, mostly. But the cockpit section, the titanium bathtub, that's going to the Air Force Museum. They want it as part of an exhibit on combat aircraft of the Afghan War." After he left, Castellanos sat quietly in the morning light, thinking about legacy and purpose. Somewhere in America, years from now, children would look at that damaged cockpit and wonder about the person who had flown it home. Maybe one of them would be inspired to become a pilot, to serve, to push beyond what others thought possible. The thought made her smile, despite the pain in her ribs. The sun climbed higher over Kandahar airfield as Castellanos made her way to the flight line for the first time since her emergency landing 3 days ago. Her ribs were still tender, and the flight surgeon had grounded her for another week. But she needed to see the aircraft, to say goodbye to the machine that had carried her through the worst day of her flying career. The A-10 sat in a corner of the maintenance hangar, surrounded by technicians who were cataloging every piece of damage. In the harsh fluorescent light, the extent of the destruction was even more apparent. The aircraft looked like it had been through a war, which, Castellanos reflected, was exactly what had happened. "Ma'am," Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, her crew chief, approached with a mixture of pride and sadness. "I've been working on A-10s for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like this. She should have fallen apart over the target area, but somehow she kept flying." Castellanos ran her hand along the damaged fuselage, feeling the rough edges where shrapnel had torn through titanium and steel. Each scar told a story of violence survived, of systems pushed beyond their limits and holding together through engineering excellence and sheer determination. "Rodriguez, you did good work on this bird. She brought me home." The sergeant smiled. "Ma'am, that wasn't the aircraft, that was all pilot." But Castellanos knew better. It had been both, machine and pilot working in perfect harmony, each pushing the other to exceed their limitations. The A-10 had been designed by people who understood that in combat, there was no margin for error, no second chances. Every rivet, every wire, every system had been built with the expectation that someday, someone's life would depend on it working when everything else had failed. She climbed up to the cockpit and settled into the familiar seat, her hands automatically finding the controls, even though the aircraft would never fly again. The instrument panel was dark, cables hanging loose where technicians had begun the process of salvaging usable components. But in her mind, she could still hear the steady hum of avionics, feel the responsive touch of an aircraft that had never let her down. "Captain," a young voice interrupted her reverie. She turned to see Second Lieutenant Williams, one of the newest pilots to arrive at Kandahar, standing at the base of the ladder. "What can I do for you, Lieutenant?" Williams shifted nervously. "Ma'am, I was wondering, when you were flying that damaged aircraft home, what were you thinking about?" It was the question every young pilot wanted to ask but rarely had the courage to voice. What did it feel like to be seconds away from death, to fly an aircraft that should have been impossible to control? Castellanos considered her answer carefully. "I was thinking about the Marines I just covered and making sure they got home to their families. I was thinking about my crew chief, who'd spent hours making sure this aircraft was mission-ready. And I was thinking about every A-10 pilot who'd ever trusted their life to this machine." She gestured to the damaged cockpit around them. "But mostly, Lieutenant, I was thinking about my job. That's what training is for, so when everything goes wrong, you don't have to think. You just do what you've practiced 10,000 times before." Williams nodded solemnly, clearly filing away every word. "Sir, do you think you'll miss it? Flying combat missions, I mean." Castellanos smiled. "Son, I'm not done yet. As soon as the flight surgeon clears me, I'll be back in the cockpit. There's still work to do out here." The lieutenant's eyes widened. After what she'd been through, the idea that anyone would choose to return to combat seemed almost incomprehensible. "Ma'am, aren't you afraid?" The question hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Castellanos remembered asking the same question when she was Williams's age, desperate to understand how experienced pilots managed to climb into their aircraft day after day, knowing that each mission might be their last. "Fear is natural, Lieutenant. It keeps you alive, keeps you sharp. The trick is not letting it make your decisions for you." She climbed down from the cockpit, wincing slightly as her ribs protested. "What you do with that fear, that's what separates the pilots from the passengers." As they walked away from the damaged aircraft, Williams asked one more question. "Captain, what do you want people to remember about what happened out there?" Castellanos paused, looking back at the A-10 one last time. "I want them to remember that when Marines needed help, help came. Everything else is just details." The awards ceremony took place on a perfect Afghan morning, with clear skies and temperatures that hadn't yet climbed to the day's brutal highs. The entire wing had gathered on the flight line, hundreds of airmen and officers standing in formation as Colonel Reeves stepped up to the podium. Behind him, a pristine A-10 Thunderbolt II gleamed in the morning sun, its gray paint scheme and distinctive profile serving as a backdrop for the proceedings. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here today to recognize extraordinary valor in the face of enemy fire." Reeves's voice carried across the assembled crowd, amplified by speakers, but needing no electronic enhancement to convey the gravity of the moment. On the 17th of this month, Captain Nix Castellanos demonstrated the highest traditions of military service and the United States Air Force. Castellanos stood at attention, uncomfortable with the attention but understanding its necessity. Military ceremonies served multiple purposes. They honored individual achievement, but more importantly, they reinforced the values and standards that held the service together. Every young airman watching would remember this moment, would carry it with them as they faced their own challenges and decisions. "Captain Castellanos," Reeves continued, willingly exposed herself to intense enemy fire to provide close air support to friendly forces in contact. Despite sustaining significant battle damage to her aircraft, she continued to press the attack until the threat was neutralized and friendly forces could be safely extracted. The citation continued, each word carefully chosen to capture not just what had happened, but why it mattered. But as Castellanos listened to the formal language of military recognition, her mind drifted to a radio call she'd received that morning. It was from Staff Sergeant Martinez, one of the Marines she'd covered during that desperate firefight. "Ma'am, just wanted you to know, my daughter took her first steps yesterday. I got to see it because you were there when we needed you most. That was worth more than any medal." The Distinguished Flying Cross is awarded to Captain Nix Castellanos for extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight. Her outstanding flying skill, dedication to duty, and courage under fire reflect great credit upon herself and the United States Air Force. The medal was heavier than she'd expected, its bronze surface already warm from the Afghan sun. As Colonel Reeves pinned it to her uniform, Castellanos thought about all the people who had made this moment possible: her parents, who had sacrificed so she could pursue her dreams; her instructors, who had taught her to fly with precision and purpose; her crew chief, who had maintained her aircraft with the knowledge that lives depended on his work. But mostly she thought about the Marines who were going home because of what had happened in the skis over Helmand Province. In the end, that was what mattered most. The ceremony concluded with a flyover, 4 A-10s in tight formation, their engines echoing off the mountains that surrounded the base. As the aircraft disappeared into the distance, the crowd began to disperse, returning to the routine duties that kept the war effort functioning. Colonel Reeves approached as Castellanos was accepting congratulations from fellow pilots. "Captain, I've got some news that might interest you. The story of your emergency landing has made it back to the States. CNN wants to do an interview, and there's been talk about a feature in Air Force Times." Castellanos shook her head. "Sir, with respect, I'd prefer to keep this low-key. There are hundreds of pilots over here doing the same job every day. I just happened to have a bad day that ended well." Reeves smiled. "I figured you'd say that. But Captain, sometimes these stories matter more than the people in them realize. Right now, there are young women across America who are watching the news and thinking that maybe they could do this job too. Maybe they could be pilots, could serve their country, could make a difference." He paused, looking out at the flight line where maintenance crews were preparing aircraft for the afternoon missions. "That's worth something, don't you think?" 3 weeks later, Castellanos was back in the cockpit, leading a two-ship formation of A-10s on a routine patrol over Kandahar Province. The familiar weight of her helmet, the steady hum of avionics, the responsive feel of control surfaces, everything was exactly as it should be. But she was different now, marked by an experience that had pushed her beyond the boundaries of normal military service. "Hawkeye 7, this is Overlord. We've got troops in contact grid 41 RQQ 123-456. How soon can you be on station?" The coordinates flashed across her display, and Castellanos felt the familiar tightening in her stomach that came with every combat mission. But this time, there was something else, a quiet confidence born of surviving the worst day of her flying career and emerging stronger. "Overlord, Hawkeye flight is 5 minutes out. What's the situation?" "Hawkeye 7, we've got a convoy that hit an IED and is now taking small arms fire from multiple positions. They're requesting immediate close air support." Castellanos checked her weapons systems and began a gentle turn toward the target area. Behind her, her wingman matched her movements with the precision that came from months of flying together in hostile airspace. "Copy, Overlord. Hawkeye flight is inbound." As the Afghan landscape rushed past beneath her wings, Castellanos thought about legacy and purpose. Every mission was someone's worst day, someone's desperate hour when the difference between life and death came down to the skill and courage of people they'd never meet. Today, she would be that difference for another group of soldiers who were counting on her to bring them home. The radio crackled with the voices of men under fire, and Castellanos pushed her throttles forward. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from the desert floor. Another story beginning, another test of everything she'd learned about flying and fighting and refusing to give up. Hawkeye 7 is on station, she transmitted, her voice calm and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Roger, Hawkeye 7, good to have you overhead. The weapons engagement was textbook perfect, precise, controlled, devastating in its effectiveness. Castellanos and her wingman worked in coordinated harmony, each attack run building on the previous one until the enemy fire ceased and the convoy was able to continue its mission. No dramatic emergency landings this time, no impossible saves, just the professional execution of close air support as it was meant to be performed. But as they flew back to base, Castellanos reflected on how much had changed since that day when she'd limped home in a burning aircraft. The whispers had stopped. The doubts about whether she belonged in a cockpit had been replaced by requests from other units who specifically wanted her covering their operations. More importantly, she discovered something about herself that no amount of training could have taught her. When everything went wrong, when the odds were impossible and failure seemed certain, she didn't break. She adapted, improvised, and found a way to complete the mission. Hawkeye 7, Kandahar Tower, you're cleared for landing runway 27. Copy Tower, Hawkeye 7 is on final. The landing was smooth and routine, the kind of unremarkable arrival that characterized 99% of military aviation. But as Castellanos taxied to the parking area, she saw Colonel Reeves waiting by the crew chief's truck. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his posture that suggested important news. She shut down engines and climbed out of the cockpit, accepting her crew chief's routine questions about aircraft status and maintenance issues. The post-flight ritual was as familiar as breathing, a comfortable routine that marked the end of another successful mission. "Colonel," she said, approaching Reeves with the easy confidence that had replaced her earlier defensiveness. "Captain, walk with me." They moved away from the flight line, away from the noise and bustle of military operations. "I've got news about your next assignment." Castellanos felt her stomach tighten. The Nellie's instructor position was still open, still waiting for her decision. But she'd grown comfortable with combat flying, had found her place in the community of pilots who lived on the edge between routine and catastrophe. "Sir, I know we discussed the weapons school position, but I'd really like to finish out my deployment here. There's still work to do." Reeves smiled. "Actually, that's not what I wanted to discuss. There's been a development." He handed her a folder marked with the kind of security classifications that meant important people were paying attention. Inside was a letter from Air Force Personnel Command, offering her a position that she'd never even considered applying for. "They want you to be part of a new program," Reeves explained. "Advanced tactical development for the A-10 platform. You'd be working with engineers and test pilots to push the aircraft's capabilities even further, to find new ways to make the Warthog more effective in close air support." The offer was intriguing, a chance to shape the future of the aircraft she loved, to contribute to its evolution and ensure that future pilots would have every possible advantage. But there was more to it than professional advancement. "Sir, this sounds like a staff position. I'm a pilot, not a desk jockey." "You'd still fly, Captain. In fact, you'd probably fly more than you do here, testing new weapons systems, new tactics, new ways of employing the A-10 in complex threat environments." Castellanos studied the paperwork, noting the prestigious assignment location and the caliber of people she'd be working with. It was the kind of opportunity that came along once in a career, the The chance to move beyond simply executing missions to actually shaping how those missions would be planned and conducted in the future. Sir, can I have some time to think about it? Of course. But Captain, I will say this. The Air Force needs people who understand both the technical capabilities of their aircraft and the human cost of the missions they fly. What you've proven here is that you're one of those people. As evening settled over Kandahar Airfield, Castellanos found herself drawn once again to the maintenance hangar, where the remains of her damaged A-10 were being systematically disassembled. The aircraft was nearly unrecognizable now, reduced to components and spare parts that would eventually find their way into other warthogs. Only the cockpit section remained intact, waiting for transport to its final destination at the Air Force Museum. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was there, overseeing the final stages of the salvage operation. "Evening, ma'am. Come to say goodbye." Something like that. She approached the damaged cockpit, running her hand along the titanium armor that had protected her during those desperate minutes over the Helmand Valley. "Rodriguez, what do you think makes a good pilot?" The question clearly surprised him, but he considered it seriously. "Ma'am, I've worked on aircraft for 12 years, and I've seen a lot of pilots come and go. The good ones, they understand that the machine is only as good as the person flying it. They take care of their aircraft, but more than that, they understand what it can do and what it can't do." He gestured to the damaged cockpit. "But the great ones, ma'am, they find a way to make the impossible happen. They push themselves and their aircraft beyond what anyone thought was possible, and somehow they make it work." Castellanos nodded, understanding the truth in his words. The decision about her future suddenly seemed clearer. "Rodriguez, what would you say if I told you I might be leaving soon? New assignment, new challenges." The sergeant smiled. "Ma'am, I'd say the Air Force is finally figuring out what they've got in you, and wherever you go, whatever you do, you'll make us proud." As she walked back toward her quarters, Castellanos thought about the letter in her jacket pocket and the choice it represented. She could stay here, continue flying combat missions, remain part of the immediate fight, or she could accept the new assignment and work to ensure that future pilots would be even better prepared for the challenges they'd face. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. The next morning, she knocked on Colonel Reeves's door with her answer. "Sir, I'd like to accept the assignment." Reeves nodded as if he'd known all along what her decision would be. "Captain, the Air Force is getting a hell of an officer." 2 months later, Captain Nix Raven Castellanos stood in the briefing room at Edwards Air Force Base, looking out at a group of test pilots and engineers who would be her colleagues in pushing the A-10 platform to new heights of effectiveness. The desert landscape outside looked remarkably similar to Afghanistan, but everything else was different. The mission, the challenges, the scope of what they were trying to accomplish. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Project Warthog Evolution," the program director announced. "Our mission is simple: to ensure that the A-10 Thunderbolt II remains the most effective close air support aircraft in the world for the next 30 years. Castellanos felt a familiar thrill at the words. This was why she'd become a pilot, why she'd chosen to serve, not just to fly missions, but to be part of something larger than herself, something that would outlast her own career and benefit pilots she'd never meet. Over the following months, she threw herself into the work with the same intensity she'd brought to combat flying. The testing was demanding, pushing both aircraft and pilots to their limits as they explored new weapon systems, new sensors, new ways of integrating the A-10 into the complex battlefield of the 21st century. But perhaps most importantly, she found herself becoming a teacher, sharing the hard-won lessons of combat experience with the next generation of A-10 pilots who rotated through the test program. They came to her with the same mixture of confidence and uncertainty she'd once felt, eager to prove themselves but unsure of what they didn't yet know. The most important thing to understand: she told one young pilot who was struggling with low-altitude weapons delivery, is that the aircraft will do everything you ask it to do. The question is whether you're asking the right thing. The pilot nodded, but Castellanos could see the same doubt in his eyes that she'd once felt. The weight of